Good evening. Thanks for being with us this evening for the fourth in our series of 5 lectures for the fall lecture series for the Technology Management Program. We're very fortunate this evening to have a distinguished speaker, Dan Doiron, joining us, and my colleague Davis Breimer will give you the bio information very shortly. I wanted to say the structure of the piece tonight will be a lecture component followed by question and answer. We'll have mics forward and in the rear of the hall so that you'll be able to frame your questions. And we are broadcasting tonight through UCTV, so try and be as clear and concise as you can on your questions, and we'll have plenty of time to engage our speaker afterwards. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and without further ado, Davis, if you'd give our speaker intro. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I guess I get to be on the podium tonight. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Dan R. Doiron. He holds a BS and MS degree in nuclear engineering, a PhD in chemical engineering, which he got here at UCSB. He is founder and CEO of LaserGuide Incorporated from 1984 to 1989, co-founder of the Western Institute for Laser Treatment and Advanced Biomedical Instrumentation in Santa Barbara, and served as board chairman of the Institute from 1986 to 1996. He is the founder of Miravant Medical Technologies Incorporated, served as the vice president of technology, and president of Miravant subsidiary PDT Systems from 1989 to 1997. Dr. Doiron is director of 2 private technology companies and managing partner in La Carencia Partners. This evening, Dr. Doiron is going to share with us his expertise in development and management of high technology startup companies. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for that introduction. A little bit on my background so you know kind of where I'm coming from in this. I did get my PhD from chemical engineering, but it was in I had a biomedical emphasis. My area of research was in biomedical applications, in electro-optics, in fiber optics. So it's kind of doing. I went from there to USC Med School for 4.5 years on an academic, and then left there and got the entrepreneur bug in about mid-1980s. And have been since then, I've started a number of companies, and since I left Miravant, which is a device and pharmaceutical company in combination, I have been involved in startup companies at a level of seed funding and early investment. So medical devices is, first of all, you got to define this. It's a pretty broad term. It really is any device that provides medical care. I think we seem to think of it from a tech point that it's really high-end technology, but it isn't. It's very broad. It can be a diagnostic or it could be a therapeutic device. In both of those, it can be hardware such as a surgical instrument, a diagnostic tool, a CT scanner. It could be anything. It can be, and most nowadays, a lot of things are software-based. Software that does the analysis in a CT scan is an example, and it could be a bio device. I think that's where the biotechnology comes into the medical device nowadays. And it can be any blending of all 3 of these. So it's a really broad-based field. It can be something as simple as an over-the-counter thing that you buy. Or it could be something that's on a prescription to you, or something that only a physician can use. So it has a very broad base. It could be an implantable device, both long-term or short-term. It could be biodegradable. I mean, it's a broad spectrum when you talk about medical device, and you're not really focusing in one particular little area. There's many issues when you talk about doing a startup in a medical device company. Each one of these issues I bring up here that I'll go through could be a lecture into itself. I mean, they're very broad. There's a lot of information there, a lot of things to cover. But basically what I'm going to try to talk to in briefly and skimming over today is to talk about technology, intellectual property, the market considerations when you talk about developing a medical device company, the issues of reimbursement. This is something that's very unique to medical device or pharmaceuticals, either one, but in the medical realm versus a lot of other technologies that are not medical. The regulatory, again, the same issue. What's the management that needs you're going to do a startup, both early stage, late stage? What's the structures that you might use? And then, of course, everybody are like, now, what's the capitalization? How do you fund a business? Technology. This is really, I know this whole series is focused on technology companies and technology startups. When you talk about technology as a business, you really got to look at a number of things. One thing is it unique? And in that uniqueness, I mean, does it solve a problem? Is there a medical problem out there, if you're talking about medical devices particularly, that this thing has a unique solution to and provides some greater advantage over what's done today? So it's got to have some problem solving, it's got to have uniqueness. The key also in that technology is what's the intellectual property? And this is broad. When you say, people ask you about your IP portfolio when they talk about tech companies. And this includes things that are patentable. It includes things that are trade secrets. And it also has to consider many things such as prior art. What other things are out there that are either in the public domain or are already patented? Becomes a thing. And what's the potential of infringement? Are you infringing on somebody else's patents by what you're doing? This would be a death wish for a startup company. Actually, some established companies it can be a death wish for also. And what's the need for licensing? Especially if this is coming out of an academic institution, what's the licensing process? How can you get the kind of licensing you need to go out and develop this? These are all things that anybody looking to fund a company will look at in depth. And what is your plan when you structure this company to protect that intellectual property? This is extremely important. You can't just say, I've got a patent, therefore I'm okay. There's all kinds of things in terms of keeping documentation of the development process, documenting when it was done, who did it, things about potential infringement and noting those and going through the process as assuring you're not infringing. Those all become important. And if you ever get into a patent battle, this is going to become extremely important, will kill a company. I don't know where that's coming from. One of the key issues is deciding in developing a medical device company is what is the market that you're really looking at. You need to define the market and what is the need in depth. This means not only the size of the market, but many other things. I had a good friend here that actually helped fund one of my very early companies, Paul Glenn, who termed something, and he termed it that when you're going to develop something, it's like a hunt. You can go, all the process you have to go through is the same if you're hunting something small or you're hunting something big. His term used to be, well, you can go hunt a rabbit, you can do an elephant hunt. And if you're going to put the effort in it and make it worthwhile, you want to do the elephant hunt. And his term used to be, I want to do the elephant herd. I mean, because what you have to go through is the same. And so you want the big opportunity. And the herd means not just, they say, that it's a real big opportunity, but you want multiple things. If you're going to develop a technology, you won't want one application, that it's one particular use you're after. You usually want to look at a technology that has multiple uses, multiple applications, so that in many cases, one of them may not work, that the other ones have a potential of working, and your markets are that much bigger. So don't get too focused down and too tight. What's the competition? Key issue in the market issues. What's existing that services this need today? But also, what's on the horizon? What things are in development? I mean, you got to consider all of these things when you're talking about what is the market for something. And then a key issue in the medical thing is how are you going to penetrate this market? What's your method of distribution? It is extremely competitive and costly to distribute medical devices into the market. There are significant barriers to entry. Established market trying to displace existing technology. You've got the problems of looking regulatory. And we'll talk about that one because that is one of the very biggest ones that really defines a difference in medical device technologies companies and other technology companies. Reimbursement is a big issue in the medical side, both drugs and devices. You hear about the rising medical cost of today in the medical side, and it's enormous. And what it's going to bankrupt our government, you hear all kinds of things about it. And so the real question is when you come to think about, I'm going to develop a medical device that serves a purpose and has an application area, who's going to pay for it? How are you going to get paid for it? It's a big issue nowadays. Is it going to be an insurance company, i.e. government or private? How are you going to, or is it going to be an individual? You'll see a lot of successful medical device companies now today are basing their businesses on models that don't rely on insurance reimbursement. LASIK, corneal shaping, key point, not reimbursed. Huge market. But people are willing to pay for it out of their own pocket. So you're not dealing with the issue of the government and the insurance is pushing you down on your pricing continuously. Cosmetic surgery is another area. The huge markets in the cosmetics. Thank you. Where that is a consideration you must right up front. So am I going into a very regulated market where I'm relying on insurance companies to pay me and get our money from it? And therefore there's a whole set of consequences that I have to consider in the development sequence of getting approval for insurance company reimbursement. Big issue. There's a case in point. When I was in academics down at USC and Children's Hospital, one of the areas I was working in was light. How does light interact and transmit in tissue? During that time, it's typical consulting as an academic, I had a company approach me from the East Coast who did transillumination of breast tissue to diagnose abnormalities. This is an old concept that goes way back. So they did already have FDA approval, which I'll talk about in the regulatory sections. But what they didn't have was a proof of how this thing worked and what ultimately was its benefit. So that's why they came to us, and this was when Dr. Profio was here in nuclear engineering. Him and I together were working on this problem. Why does the instrument work? They had some very unique ways of doing it. What this time I'm trying to get to is that company folded. And the reason it folded is it couldn't get insurance reimbursement. I mean, they could show that the technology had some benefits and everything, but they couldn't get the reimbursement and led to the failure of that company. You got to consider cost-benefit analysis. You know, if you got a new thing to do something and it costs 10 times what they do today and it has very little additional benefit, it's not going to get there. If it's a big cost item, it better have a huge benefit. Example of that is one of you from Santa Barbara may be familiar with Computer Motion, which I've been on the board, was on the board of directors from the early stages until it merged here about a year ago. Here you had it in robotics for intraoperative surgery, enabling certain things that couldn't be done, i.e. you could do a robotics, have a same-day surgery or one day and out for a heart bypass. That's ultimate goal of that business directed. Huge benefit, but huge cost, multi-million-dollar systems to do it. Plus all the training, plus all the other things that we had to go on with that, and a multiple 10-year development schedule. Huge, but huge benefit when you eliminate an open chest bypass. So you got to consider those things and cost benefit. Comparative product pricing, again, that's, you know, you can't come in with something that's going to cost 3 times more than what they do today and expect you're going to compete. And usually what I'll say to most people in technology, don't come in with another Me Too. Another Me Too product in the same field. Then pricing is just, you're being pushed all the time. And what's the business model? What I mean by this is, what is your business? Is it a disposable? Is there a recurring cost of revenue every year? Do you get paid on the device? Is it a single-time sale? How does the business expand in the future? There's various business models of how do you make money. And you have to consider that when you're considering the reimbursement. You know, the present government things is doing things on a fixed cost for a disease, a diagnostic group number. You get a hospital gets a certain number for a procedure. Their view is their profit is how much can they cut out of the cost of doing that procedure. So you've got to look at how your business model fits into that. If it's going to raise their cost and they're not going to gain anymore, they're not going to use it. It's all these things you have to consider. Now, one of the big issues for medical device, and as it is for drugs as well, pharmaceuticals, is the regulatory process. This is one of the things that really makes it unique from that of the technology companies outside the medical side. And there's really 2 parts of it. One is what happens domestically, i.e. the USA, and what happens internationally. Most of you probably know that the medical devices in this country are regulated through the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, as everybody calls. And you hear all the things in the news and everything all the time about the FDA. It controls everything from over-the-counters to things that you might be prescription or surgical use or physician-based. There are numerous classifications in the FDA, from Class 1, which is maybe something that has very little regulation, to a Class 3 or 4, which is extremely regulated. Not only from how it is used, but also can it be marketed? Can you market it in the U.S.? And there's a set of processes that allow you to determine that, and how do you get market approval to market in the U.S. And FDA controls this. The first is what we call a 510K. If you're going to do a device, if you need to have regulatory approval, you'd love to be here. This is where you'd like to start. This means what you're doing and what your device is equivalent to something that that existed prior to these regulations coming in the 1970s. So it's an equivalence issue. It may do it differently, but it's an equivalence. And you use that basis of the prior type of technology or product doing that this is similar, may do a little different, and therefore it's an equivalence. This is the quickest way to get through the FDA, if you can do it. Of course, technologies are usually very new, and this most of the time does not apply. You can do a hybrid of a 510K with what is the next thing, the IDE PMA. IDE is an investigational device exemption. When you get an IDE from the FDA, it gives you the ability to go out and clinically test your product and prove its efficacy, prove its safety. When you're done with that process, you file what's called a PMA, or a pre-market approval, which is then the FDA gives you the approval to sell that product. Okay? This is an enormous process and getting bigger all the time. It used to be devices were considered the easy way on the medical side, and pharmaceuticals were the killers. The $200 million, $300 million to develop it. Device is very rapidly picking up and catching up. The amount of clinical trials. I'll give you an example. I'm on the board and have been involved with a company that's up in San Luis that's a biodegradable materials. It's a materials thing. It's a polymer. It biodegrades, and it's a short term. It's under 90 days. Company's been 8 years in development and still isn't through its first clinical trial completely for approval. Shows you what the process can be like. And they're doing a good job of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about the clinical trial a bit later. The FDA also regulates a number of things. Not just can you market the device, they also control the processes of how it's manufactured. And nowadays, it's even gotten to the point where it oversees the developmental program. You have to have a clear program of how you're going to develop this, how you document it, how you test it, beyond just how do you manufacture it once you're in the commercial market. One of the terms that's good GEPs, good engineering practices, now come into effect, where the manufacturing process falls under good manufacturing practices. And one of the key issues that when I was doing this, actively involved in the company back in the early 90s, was the development of software validation. Software isn't everything nowadays. Microprocessor-based controls. And back then, they're better about it now. They've got it more defined, but you have to validate your software. That's a major issue. A lot of work, a lot of work. Then the other issue is when you really want to get down, as I said in the IDE PMA side, is the clinical trials. This is an enormous barrier to medical device approval. If this device has any really significant risk, or it's not just equivalent to something else, you are basically stuck in the FDA, in the US, of doing clinical trials. You have to do two things. Usually it's done in two phases in medical device. First is kind of a pilot study that looks at safety. Is it safe? Can you do a small bunch of patients, try to view what's the results, is it safe type of thing. Then you go to what they call a pivotal trial, where you have to now really prove the efficacy of the product. So you have to now define what is the endpoints. What's your judgment for results? It can be something as bad as relief of pain in a back surgery, but that gets really fishy. What's that mean? How are you going to judge it? You can't put a quantitative number to it. So you get into all kinds of quality of life tests, those types of things. Those are still evolving greatly in the FDA. You generally, a lot of times, will have to compare it to a present standard of treatment. I.e., you're going to treat something that is being treated some other way, and you hope to get better results. You have to do it in a blinded study, possibly, depending on what the technique is, what the materials is. So maybe if you have this polymer that I'm talking about, you put it in one patient, you don't put it in the next. and you look for the difference. This has a lot of doctors have a little issue with that, because in some of these tables you get into issue of how can I not give somebody something and do a blind? But that's what's required in a lot of cases. And what comes out of these clinical trials is what you can label your product for. FDA controls labeling. This means not only what's in the package, what goes with the device, but what can you promote it for? Big time of getting the FDA is go out and promote the product for something it's not been approved for. Even though a doctor may go out and use it on his own and write it up and promote it, you, as a company, cannot promote it in any way, fashion, or form. So you see that this regulatory becomes a huge hurdle, both in cost. It is a barrier to entry by others, but it's also a huge cost and a big risk. What happens if that clinical trial doesn't come out right? There are many cases. Can we get the question afterwards? I think it's the way they're organized, the presentation. And if this has happened, and I know a couple of companies that happen, is you design a clinical trial. You get to an end, you pick an endpoint that you're going to measure, and you do this. And many things, you may have to follow a patient for 6 months, a year, more. You get to the end, and you find out the efficacy study, the endpoint, it doesn't prove it. Because you might have chose your patients wrong. You might have chose the wrong test. And when you get done with it, you're stuck. And you're talking here in medical devices spending tens of millions of dollars to run these clinical trials. It's enormous. Internationally, the issue is somewhat different. Particularly the EU, which is where a lot of companies will focus initially in their product releases, has what they call the ISO 9000s. It's a 9001 and other things that require that you have to meet as a manufacturing company certain standards for your manufacturing of the business of your product. The development, it documents development, it documents many things. But their issue is more safety. Their view of it is they want to assure the thing is safe, but they let the physician control the use issue. So that they're really not labeling it for a specific use so much in the EU as they let the physician make the decision. And they did it more towards the safety. Are you controlling it? Are you manufacturing it properly? Do you know what you got? Do you know the things? So this is why many companies will go to Europe with their products before the US. And some companies will take them to Europe and never bring them in the US. Because the cost to do it in the US is so high, it's not worth it. The market might not be big enough, or it might not be worth it. So they won't do it. The USA, a lot of the countries have USA reciprocity, meaning if it's approved in the US, you can get approval in them, but it doesn't go the other way. So if you do get approval in the US, it's very easy to expand into a lot of the other European and other markets as well, but not the other way around. In particular, and then you got other markets that are just totally even worse than the US, and Japan being one of them. Part of it's protectionism, part of it's just their own view of how they run their things culturally, but it's even harder to get in than the US market. If you're going to start a company, what should your management team look like? What kind of people do you need? I know this is an engineering program here, people think, well, the number one on this should be the technology people, but from an outside group viewing the business concept and the development, it's not. First, you need somebody who's going to head this up. Who's going to be the person who's going to lead it? Because everybody looking at this company is going to look at that person first from an investment point of view. Does that person have the experience? Do they have the knowledge? Do they really understand? Can they really sell this thing to the community? So the CEO and president or whoever's going to be the top honcho is extremely important. You need somebody who's going to run operations and accounting side of it. You need marketing knowledge. I don't see you need a marketing department, since early you're not necessarily marketing this, but you have to have a marketing who can understand the market, analyze it, provide the information that assures that this market's real. You need a regulatory. I just spent all the time talking about the regulatories of medical device. They're enormous. You got to have expertise in regulatory. Then you got your whole group of technologists, depending if you're software, hardware, wherever you may be, and it's clearly not one, but it's many. You need a legal counsel. You need legal counsel not just for how to set the corporation up, but how to protect your intellectual property. That's two different legal counsels, by the way. They're not the same people. Usually firms that do anything, but how to do it, how to structure financing, how to structure a deal that's appropriate to get somebody willing to invest. Legal counsel's deeply involved in that process. And then you have accounting services. This is generally an outside accounting. If you're going to have investment, they're going to want outside accounting services account of how you're using the money, how you're reporting it properly, how you're reporting your financials. And so a number of these things, the marketing, regulatory, legal counsel, accounting service, can either be outside service or they can be consultants in the early phase, and should be, in most cases, consultants. You don't want to bring these people on board full-time at an early stage of a company. But having them involved is key. When you get to the mid or late stage of the company, the structures get more involved and much stronger. But this will be important in understanding and getting the kind of financing you may need to get to the next stage. You need a good, strong CEO still. People will look to that person as the number one issue they'll look at from personnel right up front. You need somebody who's going to be the chief operating officer, the CEO, or the president, who's going to run the operation. Because they know the CEO is usually not going to do that. If he's spending his time running operations, he's not working on the bigger picture for the company, where it's going next, how it's going to grow, all those types of things that are strategic. You usually need somebody who's going to oversee the financial. If you're raising a lot of money, people want to ensure that you're doing the right kind of control. So you need a CFO controller type person. And then they may be vice president, they could be anything, but you need people who are specializing in marketing, sales, technology. This is usually ends up being the CTO. That's where I ended up in my prior company. And you need engineering, manufacturing oversight. They may be the same at early stages. Eventually they get split. So now you talk about a management team. And as you go into later stage financing, it will be looked at very closely. Do these people have the experience? Do they have, that's the number one thing anybody will look at. Have you done it before? Have some of these people, at least some of these people have to have done it before to add to the machine, to assure that you're going to do it right and not have the pitfalls that most people will go through if you've never done it before, including myself. Pitfalls are expensive. What's the board of directors like in these types of companies? This becomes a key issue. A lot of times when people say, I want to start a company, I'm going to put it together, and all the founders become directors. Really doesn't serve the purpose of what a board of directors is for. Board of directors is an external oversight for the business. Therefore, it should be made up appropriately. And just having all the same people in the business also on the board doesn't serve anything, doesn't meet that objective at all. So you don't want all the founders involved. Usually there are some founders, surely should be involved in it. Usually the technology, top people that are the technology based are important. Do they have startup experience? That's a key of who those founders are. And have they been at the startup level? You can get people sometimes, and I've seen this in the pharmaceutical or early startups, they get somebody out of a large pharmaceutical firm. And they've been in that startup and they've been up there, but they've never been in a startup level. That's generally a mistake because their view of it is totally different. They have big budgets, they're used to big things, and it's really hard. They're good and helpful in some ways, but you got to be concerned that they understand a startup situation. Do they have market expertise? These are the kind of people you want in. For what's your market? What are you targeting? Are you targeting a therapeutic market in cancer or something? Then you want people who have cancer and know cancer markets. And what about financing? Do people have experience on that board to how to finance a company and early things and have the contacts to make that financing available? A Rolodex is important on a board. Where have they been? Who do they know? Because when you go in there to talk to them, having them being referred by somebody that's a personal contact makes a big difference. As the company grows and goes to later stages, it becomes that this board now needs to evolve. And I've just been going through this with one of the companies I'm involved with. You now need a different group of people at the board. You need people of various business experience from finance, technology, marketing, sales, industry, regulatory, all those things that are key should now get represented at the board level in terms of an oversight of what's going on in the given strategic. A board should not do day-to-day operations or be anything, but it should give overall oversight and overall direction to the company. Investors will be part of that board, and they're key. They're key. They could be VC people, venture capitalists, VCs, or they could be corporate partners if you have some kind of corporate deal where you have a distribution relationship with some corporate partner. So that also becomes important. What's the structure? Most device companies nowadays, you're going to have investors. Unless you got very deep pockets of your own, you're going to need investors. So you're going to have a corporate structure that basically it's a corporation. It's going to either be an S where you have ability to pass losses out to investors in early stages, but ultimately it needs to get a C corporation. in order to be able to have investors involved. One of the big issues that's gone round and round, where do you incorporate a company like this? In the past, a lot of people always said Delaware, because Delaware has a lot of things that are more appropriate to the corporate, that go to the corporate side, in protecting the corporation, the directors, and so forth. That's kind of changing now. The states are responding to that, and so it's not. A lot of people still are fixed on this Delaware. Some other ones are not. You see a lot of corporations going to Nevada nowadays, so it's changing. But it is important, because you don't want to be moving halfway through the sequence. Capitalization. This is a big one. This could be multiple lectures. My view of it is, and from the past experience, is you want to do capitalization in multiple stages. You really want to, and do it on a milestone basis, i.e., you've got a concept, you've got an idea. Find a first stage that's suitable for seed funding that will allow you to get to that first stage. Once you're there, and with that, you're in a much better position to get another stage of funding. Continuity is always an issue, but by doing it in this way, in stage, you can increase the valuation with minimizing the dilution. First of all, I mean, if you're going to take $10 million to do a development program, and you're going to have to give up all the company, usually, on a concept, if you're going to try to raise $10 million. First, most people aren't going to invest it. But, so there's the reality. You want to figure it out how you're going to invest them, and you want some ideas of how you may get there in the future. It may change. You may find yourself a total different direction in your development sequence, but you have to think it through. Early stages funding, the sources, that's always the key. And these sources change. You'll see on here I talk about ventures. I mean, 2 years ago, you couldn't get a venture to look at a medical device company for anything. It's changed. Things have changed now. That collapse of the market in the .com, they had a lot of stuff they had to deal with, and they weren't investing money in new ventures. They were investing in existing ventures, trying to save them and scrapping out their things, so they weren't. So in early stages, my best luck I've had with is individuals, or what we call angels in the things. These are high net worth individuals. Probably a lot of them come out of tech companies, made their money in the boom of the biotech and the internet, that had the money and are willing to invest it. Those networks of angels are now starting to coalesce. They have coalesced in a lot of cases, where you now have things such as Ket Coast Angels, a band of angels up in the Bay Area, who are now allowing angels to kind of get together, work as a team, protect themselves. They're kind of blending more to a VC, generally work with VCs, but, or doing that. But they are there. Once in a while you hit a great angel who can take you the whole way. They're unusual, but they do exist. And government grants. Government grants are great. We had, and my company's had great success with the Small Business Innovative Research Programs. We raised multiple millions of dollars through that program. They're great supplemental money, but because of the process and the timelines, they don't allow yourself to really be continuity in your business. You can't rely on them completely. But they're a good source. They're good money. In later stages, you're really looking to I think, really two main sources. Either it's the venture groups, or you're going to corporate partners. When you're getting close to seeing that you look like you got a viable product and you get anything, then corporate partners are willing to step up. VCs are willing to step up. Ventures companies have really evolved over the years. They used to be, venture was the concept, well, you've got an idea and a concept here, I'll fund it and we'll get it developed and do it. So many of the VCs now are only really interested after you've proved the concept and you're trying to march it to market, or you're trying to, and they want a late stage invested. There are some venture funds that go at early levels, but they're limited nowadays. And they're pretty selective. So you got to, when you talk about VCs as a group, you got to really be selective about what you're talking about and who you're talking to. And what's the exit strategy? This is key to the capitalization. I think any exit strategy, people, in the days of the IPO times, everybody was looking to IPOs. The VCs in particular were driving it that way because that was their exit strategy. What happened after that? They were gone. Their money, they're in new investments. But that has changed. That window is now starting to open up a little bit, but it's a total different opening. You got to be profitable, you got to be making money, you got to have good growth figures, and then you're maybe an IPO, be a ghoul, So it's different nowadays. So you can't really be looking at it. IPOs, if you're way down the road. Sale of the company, strategic placement is one of the key issues nowadays. How can you find a company that needs your technology for its growth? Companies are needing to grow, and they can't grow fast enough internally. So they're buying things in. It's one of the better ways. Or, There's big moves right now in the tax sales of saying it's better to give profits back. All these exit strategies are focused on building a profitable, viable company. If you do that, then you have exit strategy capability. And you need to build the structure accordingly and execute it accordingly to be that company can stand on its own. Then there's your value. If you don't, used to be people would build companies just for being acquired. That's extremely risky, and I don't think I would invest in a company that takes that strategy today. So in conclusion, the medical devices are really a heavily regulated field. This is what makes them different from the other technology fields. It's a long development time, and it's expensive. Not that it's not worthwhile, but it's not for the limited funds. It's very nearly impossible to bootstrap a medical device company today, not with the regulatories that are in place. Reimbursement is a major issue, and it's got to be considered up front. People say, there's a million cases of this, so I can get all this money, but will they pay for it? Key issue. Market barriers can be significant, i.e. the regulatory side, but also getting people to change their medical concepts, of willing to try something new. The medical profession is slow to change. This is a big barrier. You can find you got the greatest idea in the world. If no one will use it, don't do any good. Experience in the management team is key, and it's a team approach. I know of no company that's successful that's dependent on one person. The CEO is out there promoting the company, but then everybody else is making work and getting the work done and has to ultimately determine the company's success. It's a team. And the capitalization is extremely difficult. It's not an easy process. It's not that it can't be done, but it takes a lot, and it's very difficult. And I would like to open it up to questions.
Thank you, Dan, for speaking with us tonight. We're now going to move into a question and answer session. Would anyone like to start with the first question?
The microphone, please.
I don't think I need a microphone.
But they're recording it. So
I'm quite familiar with the process that it takes to bring a drug to market. It's years, and it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Would you say that the biotech area or the device area is inappropriately regulated by FDA and should have its own regulation or approval system within the government?
Well, it actually does. Within the FDA, they're separate. Drug and device are separate. They're totally different regulatory bodies, and so they do have their own structures. In a drug, you've got a phase 1, 2, 3 type clinical trial, toxicology, dose response, and then efficacy. So there are different in that regard, and they do allow for certain kinds of devices that don't have big risk or efficacy, problems to move through quicker. So that part, I think, is real. But I think my view is that I think the European approach that I find is much better, where they look at safety issues, they look at things, but they let the medical community make the decisions relative to what's efficacious and not, and what should be used. I think we do get overregulated in terms of there are a lot of things that could be useful to the American medical product market today that aren't there because they can't warrant the cost of development to get them into the market. They've tried to introduce things like orphan statuses in drugs, like orphan device they got in drugs, but orphan and device, that allow you to go for limited markets and give you special tracks. But you really don't save much money. And so I think it does hinder it to some degree in this country today.
More questions?
Yeah, you mentioned the Euro. Now you're talking about the European market now. You think they have a better system over there? Is the market going to go there? People who want to be treated are going to go over to Europe?
Well, it happens already. It's Europe, it's Mexico, it's outside the U.S., it's Canada in some cases, where that's already happening. But the problem is that can only happen if you got the money to do it. Personally, and this is just a personal view, that the regulations is not producing that much added benefit from what's in terms of adding the extra regulatory control. Point in fact, and this isn't device, this is drugs. The recent issue of Vioxx that's come out. They're all saying now they're going to increase the regulatory even higher. They're going to introduce more issues and more cost on the development of a drug device. Will that improve the ultimate safety? I don't believe so. Because what happens in those kinds of studies is when you move it into you never know everything until you move it into large use. Then that stuff starts showing up. And what you need to do is watch it and react to it. But you can't stop the development sequence for that because I don't care how much regulatory and testing you put in front of it, it's not going to solve the problem completely because that's part of the biological variability. The same will happen in a device. There's certain risks involved in introducing new technology, and there's benefit. And you have to weigh the two to the side. But we are definitely being, in the U.S., I think, being cramped down in our advancement of a lot of technology because of over-regulation.
I wondered if you could comment on the value of a small company or an emerging company being very fast to market and those characteristics of companies that seem to be speedier than others.
I think first, especially, it depends on what your markets are. I mean, in things that are, breaking edge, because, some people, if it's a great market, people are going to jump in. I mean, LASIK is the point, in fact. I mean, first to market is a key issue in that particular, the medical device. I think the key to that is the management team and its strategy. And I've seen this happen in the robotics, having been involved in that one. Here we had one company, local company, come out of UCSB, that really was the innovator in the forefront on that field and really went out and made that happen. You had another group that came in, they kind of said, hey, that looks like an idea, let's do something, and went in and did all kinds of things of getting other patents and trying to get infringements and trying to do this thing and moved to the market with a totally different strategy. To where the point where the original company lost the didn't make its position. It should have had a much better position. But it was a management strategy that went on there. It was a strategy. They used a regulatory strategy that was quite different, that really didn't make a lot of sense from a point of efficacy, but had a heck of a difference for the market. And got them approvals in areas quicker than the other one. And that made the difference right there.
Most of the people in this room are well under 30. And if they were to think about doing a software startup, probably by the time they were 25, they could have been involved in 2 of them. And I'm sort of wondering, as people make choices about careers and wanting to be involved in startups, but also I care about the healthcare industry, or there's something fascinating about this. Is this a startup? Is this for middle-aged entrepreneurs, or are there ways that young people can get involved in startups and the entrepreneurial bent within this industry?
Well, I'm really great to see this kind of a program here. When I came through here in the late 70s, there wasn't such a thing. And trying to bridge between engineering and medical was a tough bridge. There weren't very few programs in the country, and it was really not easy to do. These kind of programs have now given, I think, a lot of these students tools that we didn't have any exposure to back in our time. So I think their value to the early stage company is much greater today. They provide with having this knowledge and going into it is much greater. I think not to say stay away from startups by any means. There's a great part to be learned. It's a great learning place. Because in a startup, you get to do all kinds of things. You get exposed to a lot more than you do in a big corporation, where if you're an engineer in a technical firm, you're in that group and that's where you stay. You don't really get exposed to the other one. I prefer early stage companies myself because that's the thrilling part. And it gets too compartmentalized when it gets bigger. So no, they are existing, and they will continue to exist, because I think a lot of the innovation comes from the early startup and people who are willing to sit out and risk. I just think the environment's different today, and it's got to be thought through. If I knew what I knew when I went out and did my first startup, I probably wouldn't have done it. I think that's probably true of a lot of them, because you learn from the hard knocks. And it's good. Programs like this will give at least a good base knowledge of more of the things you need to know as you go there and be of more value.
You mentioned a little bit about reimbursement. I was wondering if you can go into a little bit more detail about the process of doing that. Obviously, there's the government, and there's a lot of insurance companies and doctors. Do you go knocking door to door on insurance companies, or do you start with the government, or do you have your doctors pull for reimbursement? How do you go about?
What you should be considering is when you go into, if you are in a clinical trial business, in which most, I think the technology business will be in some kind of clinical trial base of their development. They won't get just approval to move into market just because of the nature, it's new technology. is you need to be considering that process while you're doing your clinical trials, not afterwards. You need to be designing your trials and talking to the insurance reimbursement groups beforehand. In designing your trials, not just talk about the efficacy, but to talk about the ability to gain reimbursement. And so it is something nowadays that has to come up front in the early stages of the development of the company of how you're going to get this. How are you going to win them over and be able to get reimbursement allocations from private insurance, if that's the kind of business segment you're going into. The government, if you do in the private group, the government probably will come with it as well. You're serving both purposes. And the biggest issue, of course, in the government through Medicare and Medi-Cal and all those types, is they're trying to put, as all companies, pushing it down cost-wise. So how are you going to fit into that environment? But you just got to consider it early and move on it early, which means there are processes you go through to develop it and get approval and get the insurance to nod to it, and you can get way ahead of that curve. Otherwise, you could go through regular and get your approval and go out and sell a product, and nobody will pay for it. And that's happened. And that's a real problem.
How do you avoid dilution? I have a number of friends who had a really good idea. In some instances, it was their life's work. They went out and they formed a company. They were the key technical people in the company, like some of the people in this room might become one day. Mm-hmm. And then they get diluted out of the picture, and 2 years later what you discover is the company is off doing quite well, and somehow they've been so diluted that they become irrelevant. How can you avoid dilution?
Well, part of the thing that I said is watch, if you do your financing in stages. So you don't take the major dilution right up front. That's probably the best way. So you can, people say, well, if I can get the money, I'll get it right now. Well, there's some logic to that. If the money's available, take it all now and don't wait, because you don't know what the market will be like 2 years from now when you need more money. The problem with that is it causes more dilution. So the answer is just try to stage your company as much as you can. I think one of the bigger issues, having been a technology person starting a company myself, is to understand that, yeah, the dilutions are going to come, and it's going to come with the money. And they're going to come hard, because that's the money talks. And so the best thing you can do is try to, minimize the amount of money you need, and when you need it. The further you are down the road, the better you are. But it's always tough. But the bottom line you got to look at, from my point, my own is it's not the percentage you own of a company, it's the value. Okay? And that's the one, and venture side guys tell that to you all the time, but it's real. You got to consider, not do I own 20%, but what's that 20% worth versus I own 1%. And if you go through a full development sequence, you're doing pretty good if you end up 1 or 2% of the company in the end. Really. But it's worth something. But it's unusual to come up with, I own 30% of it at the end of it. Those are unusual cases.
Dan, you've been kind enough to give us a profile of some of the experiences you've had. Where do you see the elephant hunt in the next 3 to 5 years? Where are those opportunities?
That's a good point. I think the biomaterials is one area. It's one of the companies I'm involved with right now. But in looking at that field of biomaterials for medical uses is a big one. Because I think the uses are very broad. You're not looking at a biomaterial used for one specific application. You got multiple applications. Take, for instance, drug delivery as a device. Things that, of sustained release, local sustained release. Huge application area. That these are things we want to do. But because you want to look at an area, what they may be, which doesn't have one application. If you're going to treat a cancer, you don't want to be treating one type of cancer only. You want to be able to have other applications. I can give an example, and how you don't know where it's going to end up. Miravant, particularly. That company and that photodynamic therapy, which is where it started out of, was all focused in cancer originally. Where does its market end up? Macular degeneration. That's where the approvals are, and that's where its market is today. If somebody would have talked about that 10, goes back 15 years ago when we started that process, you never knew it. But here, you're looking at is a technology that has multiple uses and broad use, because you don't know where it's going to end up. So, like I said, biomaterials is one I can think of, because that's one I'm kind of tracking myself, that I think has a real big potential in the future.
So Dan, as an investor, if you're looking at, let's say, a business plan, and you're considering giving money to this group who is starting a company, can you give maybe 3 top things that you use to evaluate your interest in investing in that company?
3, and I'm not going to prioritize them in order here. They're not really prioritized because the mixes can change. Technology is definitely one of them. You know, what is the technology? Is it innovative? Does it have a need? Is it protectable? I mean, that's clearly, what's your intellectual property issue? To me, I mean, as a technology person, that's a key issue. The management team is key. And the application area. I think those are probably the 3. Are you in an application area that really has the opportunities for the big hit? I mean, can you really go in and make a big difference and make a big market and multiple uses? So really, it's technology, what is its uses, and the management team. Because and most people will say that. I mean, it's interesting, having gone through this with one company recently from a vesting point of view. You know, venture come in. The first thing they did is look at the technology. They looked at the market, and they said, okay, then they looked at the management. Because their view is first of all, is the market real? Is the technology real? And then you have the team to make it happen. And it kind of goes in that order. And so I think those are really the 3 key the issues I look at, and I've seen most of the professionals do the same thing.
One other point, Dan, you mentioned having a broad scope on the investment opportunity. If you're into a program of R&D and as a technical officer, now you're into year 2.5, and board meetings coming up, how do you do that sit-down that says, folks, we're going from cancer research to macular degeneration? That's a bit of a stretch.
It is a tough stretch, and that's really, I think, in a later stage, as you move from middle stage and up, the CTO job is really that. I mean, that is the job, is to understand where technology, and not just what you did in your own area and your expertise, but what's going on abroad across the board. And where should you be going with this technology and understanding the concepts? A lot of times, you know, that's hard to start if you get people, you know, maybe because the way it started, the guy who's the technology guru became the CEO. A lot of times I think what he needs to do is step out of that role, because that takes a different expertise and focus his expertise where it's good, which is understanding technology, markets. Now, it's not always easy to get the board to accept that or to do it. I mean, it's few, but that's one of the hard challenges, is to get them to keep broader views. I mean, so it's a tough one to do, but it needs to be done.